Thank you all very for attending this evening's seminar. It's an honor to be here to present with my colleagues. All three of us have centralized Berdyaev in one way or another in our papers, as is appropriate for his 150th year. Anna started out with a more cultural consideration of Berdyaev, his role in cultural and intellectual history. Then Brad took us up and down metaphysical heights and depths, and I will return us to questions of intellectual history, specifically Berdyaev's role in the 20th century history of human rights. I'm a professor of intellectual history at the College of St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota, and I'm co-director of the Northwestern University Research Initiative in Russian philosophy, literature, and religious thought. After his expulsion from the Soviet Union in 1922, Nicolas Berdyaev became perhaps the best-known Russian philosopher in the world. In the summer of 1924, he moved from Berlin to Paris, where together with Emmanuel Mounier and Jacques Maritain, he founded and led the interwar philosophical movement known as personalism. Recently, personalism has attracted a lot of attention because of its connection with the 20th century history of human rights. In his ironically titled 2015 book, Christian Human Rights, the intellectual historian, legal scholar Samuel Moyn shows how personalism formed the philosophical framework for the elaboration of human rights in the 1940s, culminating, of course, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. The main figure in this history, Moyn's history, is the great Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain. His 1942 book, The Rights of Man and Natural Law, set the French philosopher Maritain on the path to become, in Moyn's estimation, quote, the premier post-war philosopher of human rights. Indeed, the most prominent thinker of any kind across the world to champion rights in the post-war moment, end quote. Maritain was one of the intellectual architects of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and he chaired the UNESCO Committee on the Philosophical Principles of the Rights of Man, which met in 1947. Maritain's Catholic tradition, or Christian tradition, was French, Catholic, and Thomistic. But he knew about and was close to the Russian religious philosophical tradition, first of all through his Russian-born wife, Raisa, but also through the Russian religious philosophical emigration in Paris. In arguing that Christian personalism was the conceptual grounding for human rights in the 1940s, Moyn refers to, quote, the émigré Russian Orthodox philosopher Nicolas Berdyaev, who brought to the West an old Russian tradition of religious personalism, end quote. Berdyaev and Maritain became close friends after the Russian philosopher moved to Paris. Their rich correspondence began in 1925 and continued until 1946. It has been published in a recent excellent edition by Sister Teresa and Bernard Machadier. Anna Siljak is preparing an excellent English edition, and I am grateful to her for sharing it with me in advance. And I have drawn her here on her lucid introduction. Berdyaev's wife, Lydia, was a Russian Catholic, like Raisa, who was a Jewish convert, and another Russian emigre in their circle, Helen Izvolsky, or Izvolskaya, who was the daughter of the former Tsarist minister and ambassador to France. In 1942, a year after fleeing France, Helen published an important memoir, Light Before Dusk, a Russian Catholic in France, 1923 to 1941. The light in her title was Christian Humanism Before the Dusk of the Nazi Invasion. She, Izvolskaya, celebrates Maritain and Berdyaev as great Christian humanists who inspired the, quote, spiritual revolution that took place between 1930 and 1940 in France, end quote. In his emigre period, Berdyaev devoted a number of important works to the history and philosophy of humanism in various forms. He conceived personalism as a new form of Christian humanism. At least 4 of these works present his ideas on human rights, and I will focus on them in this paper. The first is The New Middle Ages, which was translated into German in 1924, into French in 1927, and into English in 1933 under the title The End of Our Time. On March 4th, 1925, Maritain wrote to Berdyaev, and this is from the correspondence that has been edited in now 3 editions, quote, "My wife has begun to read and translate out loud for me your book, Un Nouveau Moyen Âge. It is a great comfort and lively pleasure for me to see how on so many essential points, and especially the criticism of the modern world, our ways of thinking converge," end quote. That was Jacques. One essential point on which they agreed, Maritain and Berdyaev, was the fundamental personalist distinction between the individual, a biological and sociological concept, and the person, a spiritual and religious concept. Maritain made this very distinction in a section of his book, 3 Reformers, published in the same year, 1925. In it, he wrote famously, quote, "As individuals, we are subject to the stars. As persons, we rule them," end quote. Maritain was so impressed by Berdyaev's book that he helped to arrange for its publication in a book series that he edited. The book, in its 3 translations, was very influential and helped to make Berdyaev's international reputation. It decisively shaped Maritain's own ideas of humanism and personalism, especially as expressed in his monumental 1936 treatise, Integral Humanism. A decade later, in 1934, 10 years after the New Middle Ages, Berdyaev published the Russian edition of The Fate of Man in the Modern World. So that's the second book that I will deal with today. It was translated into French in 1936. He sent Maritain a copy with the inscription to my, quote, "to my dear friends, Jacques and Raisa Maritain, affectionately, N. Berdyaev." The book is an astute and penetrating analysis of society, culture, ideology, and politics in Europe after the Great War. Berdyaev referred to it as a sort of second volume to The End of Our Time. Indeed, both volumes form a set on Berdyaev's philosophy of history and lay out his understanding of the meaning and fate of modern humanism, which he presents as a type of prehistory to personalism and a justification for the movement. The book which in some sense, now this is the third book that I will deal with, the book which in some sense begins the movement, the personalist movement, might well be considered Berdyaev's The Destiny of Man, published in Russian in 1931 and in French in 1935. In August 1935, Raisa read the book, admired it, and spoke with Jacques about it. So far as I know, it, The Destiny of Man, is the first text in which Berdyaev uses the term personalism. He had long been a personalist philosopher. He had long explicated the centrality of Lichnost, or the person. But the French term, personalism, he seems to first use in The Destiny of Man in 1931. In any event, it is an early use of the term in the emerging movement, which would take its name. Some months earlier, on December 8th, 1930, a meeting was held at Berdyaev's home, which launched the journal Esprit and the personalist movement. In his memoirs, Berdyaev wrote that the movement's combination of socialism and personalism was expressed in the newly coined term personalism communautaire. He adopted a similar term, personalist socialism, to designate his own mature social philosophy, which he expounded in the fourth work I will consider this evening, Slavery and Freedom, which he wrote in 1936 as a synthesis of his personalist philosophy. These 4 volumes form 2 sets. The End of Our Time and The Fate of Man in the Modern World are more historical, while The Destiny of Man and Slavery and Freedom are more strictly philosophical. Both sets offer a personalist defense of human rights, and they do so years before Maritain made his celebrated turn to human rights in 1938. The End of Our Time made a deep impression on Maritain and his contemporaries. Another Catholic scholar who owed a great deal to it was Henri de Lubac, whose book, The Drama of Atheist Humanism, closely follows Berdyaev's interpretation and reinforced it. His main conclusion, exactly like Berdyaev's, was that the chief result of humanism was, quote, the annihilation of the human person, end quote. If Berdyaev's main ideas now seem familiar to us, it is because they have long been accepted as persuasive, authoritative, and standard, at least for readers who recognize the spiritual side of human nature and of reality. But at the time, they were fairly novel. In his book, Berdyaev recounts how, over the course of modern history, humanism increasingly abandoned its late medieval and Renaissance religious origins. Both he and Maritain see the beginnings of this abandonment in the Renaissance itself, though that may be something of an anachronism. In any event, beginning with the Renaissance, beginning with the Enlightenment, the idea of God, and certainly the church, came to be seen as an artificial yoke on a newly imagined natural man and as an obstacle to his freedom, autonomy, and self-realization. The new modern man, Berdyaev wrote, quote, is indifferent to divine sanctions and wants to be the maker and master of life without help from on high. He tore himself from his religious center to which all his life had been directed during the Middle Ages, end quote. He did not realize, Berdyaev continues, that when, quote, he lost the spiritual center of being, he lost his own center at the same time, end quote. That takes Berdyaev to his main thesis. The modern development of humanism leads not only to its self-destruction, but what is far worse, to the destruction of the very concept of the human person. The fundamental antinomy, as he calls it, of humanism is that it glorifies man and attributes unlimited powers to him, while also making him, quote, a limited dependent creature, end quote, that is a purely natural being rather than a spiritual one. This antinomy turns humanism into its opposite. Man is no longer worth glorifying, but rather pitying. He defines the theme of modern history in the following words, quote, it is an unfolding of ideas and events wherein we see humanism destroying itself by its own dialectic. For the putting up of man without God and against God, the denial of the divine image and likeness in himself, lead to his own negation and destruction, end quote. humanism developed in a way that denied the spiritual element in man, and this naturalization of the human being was its destruction. For a proper idea of the human must relate it to the divine. Without the divine or spiritual, what is left is no longer the person, but merely the individual. This distinction, as we have seen, between person and individual is a central one for personalism. As Berdyaev puts it, individualism is founded on no eternal principle. It has nothing ontological about it. Personality exists only where God and the divine are recognized, end quote. That's from the New Middle Ages. Berdyaev uses the term abstract humanism to describe this ontologically groundless and spiritually bereft individualism. It may have been the cue for Maritain's term integral humanism from his 1936 treatise of that title, which integrates the divine and the human into a stable and secure personalism. Abstract humanism is hard to sustain. Berdyaev notes that it leads to extreme individualism, as in Nietzsche's Superman, and extreme socialism, Marxism, and that both of these take the place of the lost God. Atheistic humanism becomes its own type of religion. The denial of God and of the divine image and likeness in man leads to the false divinization of man. Man makes of himself a God. Berdyaev had long regarded socialism as the logical culmination of abstract humanism, and he had developed the socialism as religion theme in his pre-revolutionary writings. His return to this theme in his emigre period resonated widely. Following him, many scholars, including Maritain, interpreted totalitarian ideologies, came to interpret totalitarian ideologies as secular or political religions. Berdyaev is perhaps best known as a philosopher of freedom, and he gives the concept ample attention in The End of Our Time and The Fate of Man in the Modern World. One of his main criticisms of modern humanism is that its idea of freedom is not oriented toward truth and other absolute values. Rather, freedom is understood, quote, as the right to choose no matter what truth or lie, end quote. For him, Berdyaev, freedom is not valuable in itself, but rather as a necessary means for the inner recognition of truth and other absolute values. To be sure, truth is truth, but it must be freely, inwardly accepted in order to be recognized as one's own. Otherwise, there can be no genuine self-determination, which depends on inwardly freely recognized ideals such as truth. This is the core concept of freedom of conscience, which Berdyaev cherished and which he regarded as the first and most important human right. It is closely related to one of his central ideas, freedom of the spirit. Together with freedom, another one of Berdyaev's important ideas is democracy. Berdyaev did not prize one form of government over another. He was keenly aware of the potential for the abuse of power in any form of government. He regarded the state as a necessary evil. What limits state power in the final instance, according to Berdyaev, is society's recognition of higher spiritual values and the level of moral consciousness in society. In a political context, the most important higher spiritual value is human dignity, as he emphasizes in The Fate of Man in the Modern World. Perhaps no form of government is worse than what might be called, though this is not Berdyaev's term, illiberal democracy. He was highly critical of modern democracies because popular sovereignty, the people's will, is a terrible source of power when it is not limited by higher values and when there are no criteria by which to judge it. He refers to it as profane democracy in order to stress its relativism, rejection of truth and other absolute values, and unbridled, purposeless freedom. It is appalling, he writes, with undisguised contempt, to quote, be domineered over by human masses which do not submit themselves to any higher truth. So we come up against the inevitable need to put boundaries to democratic autocracy, that's his term, just as to any human autocracy, monarchist or other, end quote. So what are these boundaries? That question takes us directly to Berdyaev's consideration of human rights. In The End of Our Time, his first reference to the concept is, interestingly, in the context of Russia. He writes that, quote, the Russians took over the last fruits of European humanism at the moment of its decay, when it was destroying both itself and the divine image in man. And no other people, Berdyaev writes, has gone to such length in the destruction of that image and of human rights and liberty, end quote. This reference already makes clear that Berdyaev understood human rights in a normative sense and that he endorsed them as the necessary limits of power. In The Fate of Man in the Modern World, he writes, this is an important quotation from him, if there is an eternal element in democracy, it is surely connected with the idea of the subjective rights of the human personality, with freedom of spiritual life, freedom of conscience, thought, speech, and creativity, end quote. Again, he warns about the dangers of popular sovereignty, which, quote, may abolish all liberty and completely suppress human personality, end quote. Hence the importance of, quote, the idea of the inalienable subjective rights of the human personality, end quote, the origins of which are not social or political, but he says rather spiritual and Christian. In The End of Our Time and The Fate of Man in the Modern World, Berdyaev traces the historical origins of human rights not to the French Revolution, but rather to the proclamation of freedom of conscience in the Protestant Reformation. Though he does not refer to him, here Berdyaev is siding with the German legal philosopher Georg Jelinek, who in his classic book from 1895, The Declaration of Rights of Man and of Citizens, a contribution to modern constitutional history, Jelinek argued that human rights developed out of a long tradition of natural law and first acquired their modern constitutional and institutional forms in colonial North America, and there as a result of the struggle of Protestant dissenters for religious freedom. So Berdyaev follows Georg Jelinek in his understanding of the historical origins of human rights. According to him, Berdyaev human rights are religious in their historical origin and spiritual in substance. And for those two reasons, he thinks modern democracies can no longer defend human rights. Modern democratic freedom, he writes, is negative, abstract, and formalistic, when it needs to have positive spiritual content and be oriented toward truth and other absolute values. For Berdyaev, liberalism is a bad word, standing for bourgeois capitalistic civilization with its materialism and selfish individualism. It does not understand liberalism, does not understand the spiritual foundation and ends of freedom, and it cannot defend the rights of the person. Liberalism, Berdyaev writes, quote, has separated the citizen from the integral personality. It has separated rights from responsibilities. For in the final analysis, freedom is not only rights, it is duties as well. That's from The Fate of Man and the Modern World. He continues, quote, "The petrifaction of freedom in liberal democracies has come about just because freedom was comprehended individually, not personally, and was often interpreted as meaning, leave me in peace. In short," he continues, "liberty has no permanent foundations in liberalism," end quote. It is clear that Berdyaev believes that the defense of human rights rests not on liberalism in his pejorative sense of the term, but on personalism. He came to this conclusion at least 7 years before Maritain turned his personalism into a theory of human rights. If we count just the emigre writings in which he explicitly uses the term personalism, if I am right, that his first use of the term is in The Destiny of Man from 1931. He does not use the term in The End of Our Time, unless I missed it. He does use the term in The Fate of Man in the Modern World, where he succinctly defines personalism as, quote, "the realization in man of the image and likeness of God," end quote. In his more strictly philosophical texts, The Destiny of Man and Slavery and Freedom, Berdyaev also defends human rights. The earlier text, The Destiny of Man, 1931, has a short section on personalism, which, as I mentioned, may be the first use of the term itself by Berdyaev, and is a very, very early use of the term in the emerging movement that would take its name. There are some important formulations about personalism. For example, individuality is a naturalistic, these are all quotes, individuality is a naturalistic and biological category, while personality is a religious and spiritual one. Let me just skip over and refer to one other important formulation in his section on personalism. He says, that, quote, "The Holy Trinity is a trinity of persons just because they presuppose one another and imply mutual love and intercommunion." Another quote, "Personalistic metaphysics and ethics are based upon the Christian doctrine of the Holy Trinity." So importantly, Berdyaev traces the historical origins of personalism to the Christian doctrine of the Holy Trinity. In both The Destiny of Man and Slavery and Freedom, Berdyaev raises the issue of human rights in the context of his discussion of the state. In the first volume, he affirms that since the person is of absolute value, it is of course higher than the state. And it is, quote, "from the point of view of Christian personalism, that the individual must pass moral judgment upon the state," end quote. There now follows a categorical statement about human rights. This is in The Destiny of Man from 1931. And as we've seen, he echoes the statement that I'm about to read in The Fate of Man in the Modern World. So he clearly thought this particular formulation, which I'm going to read to you in its original form, was very important. Here's what he says, quote, "The only political principle which is connected with absolute truth is the principle of the subjective rights of the human personality, of the freedom of spirit, of conscience, of thought and speech," end quote. So for Berdyaev, everything in politics is relative except human rights. In Slavery and Freedom, Berdyaev endorses the concept of human rights already in the introduction to the book, where he attempts to explain for readers of his previous works the alleged contradictions in his thought. He writes, quote, "The fundamental contradiction in my thinking about social life is bound up with the juxtaposition in me of two elements: an aristocratic interpretation of personality, freedom, and creativeness, and a socialistic demand for the assertion of the dignity of every man, of even the most insignificant of men, and for a guarantee of his rights to life," end quote. Later in the book, he remarks simply, perhaps too simply, that the state's, quote, one and only task is to protect and preserve human rights. Another quote, power, government is only the servant, simply the defender and guarantor of the rights of man, and nothing more, end quote. These statements are perhaps unremarkable, but elsewhere in Slavery and Freedom, Berdyaev arrives at something more significant and prescient. Because of his emphasis on the primacy of the spiritual, that is, of course, Maritain's term, it might be thought that he, Berdyaev, held the body in contempt. But he is quick to counter this notion, writing that Descartes' dualism of body and soul is, quote, absolutely false and out of date. Rather, he, Berdyaev, affirms that the vital unity of body and soul, defining the person as the spirit, soul, body entity. And now there follows a far-sighted passage for its time. He writes, quote, personalism must recognize the dignity of the human body, the inadmissibility of treating it wrongly, and the right the body has to a truly human existence. And therefore, even the problem of daily bread becomes a spiritual problem. The rights of the human body are bound up with the value of personality, and it is for this reason that the most shocking encroachments upon personality are in the first place encroachments upon the body. It is first of all the human body that they starve, beat, and kill, and through the body this process spreads to the whole man. The spirit in itself you can neither beat nor kill, end quote. Berdyaev's influence on Maritain is evident at many points. Bernard Hubert counts 46 references to him in Maritain's publications. Maritain's great work of 1936, Integral Humanism, shows many similarities to Berdyaev's personalism, yet there is no explicit endorsement of human rights in the 1936 book. That dramatically changes with Scholasticism and Politics, which was based on 9 lectures, which Maritain delivered in the United States in the autumn of 1938. What he calls the personalist conception of democracy is, quote, first of all determined by the idea of man as God's image and by the idea of the common good, of human rights, and of concrete liberty. And it is based on Christian humanism. Maritain continues, I do not pretend at all, however, that personalist democracy may ever impose itself in the name of the Christian creed, end quote. He refers repeatedly to quote, the primordial rights of the human person, which are, he says, the very basis of governmental authority. That, again, that's from his 1938 book, Scholasticism and Politics. So we can now date quite precisely in the very work in which Maritain makes the turn. And it's in that book, Scholasticism and Politics. What accounts for the shift in Maritain's expressed position on human rights between 1936 and 1938? It would be nice for lovers of Berdyaev to say that it is Berdyaev who is responsible for the turn, but it's more complicated. It is clear that the immediate cause for Maritain's turn was that he was following the remarkable changes in the church's position on human rights that were introduced by Pope Pius XI in 2 encyclicals, both issued in March 1937. Mit brennender Sorge was directed against the Nazis. In it, Pius XI declared, quote, man as a person possesses rights that he holds from God and which must remain with regard to the collectivity beyond the reach of anything that would tend to deny them, to abolish them, or to neglect them. The second encyclical, Divini Redemptoris, was directed against communism. Maritain himself quotes it. God has endowed man with many and varied prerogatives, the right to life, to bodily integrity, to the necessary means of existence, the right to tend toward his ultimate goal in the path marked out for him by God, the right of association and the right to possess and use property, end quote. So now let me turn to my final paragraph in conclusion. Thus it was Pope Pius XI who was the direct cause of Maritain's turn to human rights, not Berdyaev, who himself and Maritain's easy transition by making it clear that the concept of human rights was a natural concomitant to personalism. And it is surely remarkable that Russian religious idealism was an explicit theory of human rights long before Berdyaev christened it personalism. This is clear not only in the case of Berdyaev himself, whose contribution to the 1902 collection, Problems of Idealism, was a powerful defense of human rights. It is clear also in the case of Russia's greatest religious philosopher, Vladimir Soloviev. In one passage of his great work of moral philosophy, Justification of the Good, from 1897, Soloviev calls the image of God the power of representation of absolute perfection, and the likeness of God the power of striving to achieve the image. This double infinity, as Soloviev calls it, the double infinity of the image and likeness of God in man, belongs to everyone. And Soloviev says, it is in this that the absolute significance, dignity, and worth of human personhood consist, and this is the basis of its inalienable rights. That's from 1897, and it's a prescient early statement of the personalist foundations of human rights. Another example is Boris Chicherin's magnum opus from 1900, Philosophy of Right, Philosophia Prava, which is a profound idealist defense of human rights and the rule of law. Thus, as paradoxical as it may seem, the, quote, old Russian tradition of religious personalism, as Moyn refers to it, was a robust theory of human rights decades before the Catholic Church and Maritain made their own very similar personalist discoveries for human rights and transformed the international understanding of human rights. Thank you very much.
All of you today. I don't have a lot of time for questions, but I think that a couple of questions.
Questions, comments?
Yeah,
happy to
happy
to address them for you. Mm-hmm. Please.
Do you think there were links between Berdyaev's thought and Russian cosmism?
Russian cosmism. So we had a conference in Krakow, Poland last week, and there was a paper by Frederick Maritain, who is a Canadian-based scholar, addressing this very question of the links between Fyodorov and Berdyaev, right? Yes, yeah, and according to Maritain's interpretation, Berdyaev credited and celebrated Fyodorov for his emphasis on the resurrection of all human beings. He appreciated that Fyodorov understood that previous generations of human beings must not be consigned to oblivion as merely the means for the progress, self-actualization, theosis of future human beings. But Berdyaev criticized Fyodorov for taking a technical approach to the problem, a scientific technical approach, rather than a religious or eschatological approach to the problem. Berdyaev becomes very critical of technicism, modern technological society in his emigre period, and he saw Fyodorov. So he saw Fyodorov as, in many respects, a prophet, but also he was wary of the dangers of technological civilization. Good. Thank you for that question. Please.
Yes. I think something has to be said as a general background about Berdyaev's immense popularity in France. He was very, very influential. And for example, he sort of started or encouraged very much the Dostoevsky mania in the beginning of the before the Second World War, and his book on the Great Inquisitor and Dostoevsky.
Yes.
After Berdyaev, they all quoted the Great Inquisitor and Camus and Stavrogin. They became just like Monsieur Jourdain or you know the French well-known characters in literature. It's very important. And this is one thing, and also is the way he explained to the French or to the West, but he started with the French.
Yes.
The Russian Revolution. That is his book on this meaning of Russian revolution, communism,
right.
Is very important because of his parallel between the third Rome and the Third International. Yes. And this became a sort of cliche. And Berdyaev was beautifully translated. Thanks to Maritain.
Maritain arranged the arranged the translation.
So he was almost immediately translated, and he took part in all sorts of forums and was invited. And what else did I want to say? Yes, and also the Berdyaev, I think, answered when he came to France and to the West. He answered to a sort of thirst for things Russian.
Yes.
So
Anna's important point.
He gave that dimension. He answered that. You know, and Maritain was a great Russian lover.
Yes, literally his wife.
So through his wife, and he liked the Russian atmosphere, and Berdyaev liked that too. He said Maritain's house is like a Russian house. You know, you come, lots of people come, invited, not invited, and there's always tea or something, and it's very informal. And Maritain was not like that. He was very anti-bourgeois.
Yes. Thank you so much for your role in making the correspondence available in Russian and Polish. Well, it's an important help. It's a very important contribution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that we should finish now.
Any other questions that anyone has?
You go somewhere in the restaurant.
Oh yeah,
the
true Russian style.
Actually, I do have a question.
Please.
Yes, it's not. It doesn't concern Berdyaev, but it rather concerns the first speaker with with his conception of Weber.
Yes.
And the conception of Western way of thinking,
The Western, sorry, what? I'm sorry.
way of thinking.
Yes.
Yes. I'm an economist, so I do think not philosophically, but rather efficiently.
Yes.
So why do you think the Western I'd say Western thinking concept, why does it conquer the world, the Asian world also? Because the Chinese world, it does develop due to the Western concept, due to the opening to the West.
Okay. Oh, so you mean why is it that Weber's understanding maybe of the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism is the conquering concept, right? So capitalism wins.
Exactly, yeah.
Protestantism wins.
Good.
I'm not saying that processes being
No, not Protestantism, but the ethic. The ethic wins.
Yeah, just
The-
go ahead and answer
yeah.
the question. It's good.
So I think certainly Weber also believed that it was a conquering concept. It was one that had triumphed. And in speaking about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, he was talking about progress and success. I mean, he was very open about it being a story of progress and a story of success. But I think what's so interesting about what I have seen in some of his writings is that though it was progress, capitalism, Protestant ethic, hard work, imperialism, and though it was success, humanity lost something in the process. They lost an understanding of meaning, true understanding of meaning. They lost a sense of wholeness.
Yeah.
They materially.
But what?
And so what he writes about, he's undeniable. He was very critical of a lot of Russian backwardness, what he might call, that they weren't very successful economically, that they were stagnant in some way. But he was a very subtle thinker in that he thought it may be that they didn't achieve as much as the West did, and that was not good. But they did achieve some other things. They did understand some other things. They did struggle with meaning, truth, salvation, higher transcendence. And he thought that the West had lost it. That's what disenchantment is. We've lost
not effectiveness. Yes.
Pardon me?
Not effectiveness.
Yes, connectedness for sure, brotherhood, spirituality, right? And so he was aware of the trade-offs. I'm not saying he would have chosen one over the other, but he was very aware that when you gain something, you lose something else. And that was, I think, something he got from Tolstoy and from Soloviev.
Good. Thank you. So I guess at this point, we should probably conclude.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, everyone.